Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. We're excited to have you. We're going to take just a couple of minutes to allow everybody to log in, and then we'll start. Welcome everyone. My name is Tom Toch. I am Director of FutureEd, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on the future of standards-based school improvement, co-hosted by FutureEd and CenterPoint Education Solutions. Exposing more students to challenging coursework, teaching students to higher standards, has been a cornerstone of the educational equity agenda for several decades. But in recent years, the standards movement has been criticized by both conservatives and liberals, the left and the right, and most suggest that it has lost some momentum, even as the need to address the long-standing soft bigotry of low expectations in public education remains undiminished, as post-pandemic test results made clear. So a daunting question looms over the education sector today, one with immense implications for the twin goals of social mobility and racial justice. How can policymakers help local educators complete the unfinished agenda of the standards movement? We have a panel of experts to help us answer that important question this afternoon. Michael Cohen is a senior fellow at CenterPoint Education Solutions, a nonprofit organization that helps school districts improve the coherence of their instructional systems. He helped launch and lead the standards movement as the Director of Education Policy at the National Governors Association during 8 years in the Clinton administration, and during 17 years as President of Achieve, a nonprofit organization that helped play a central role in the development and implementation of the Common Core state standards, the next generation science standards, and the Partnership for Assessment of College and Careers, the state testing consortium known as PARCC. Checker Finn is President Emeritus of the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, a Washington-based policy center, a former Assistant U.S. Secretary for Research and Improvement in the Education Department in the Reagan administration, a former member of the governing board of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and a prolific contributor to the national conversation on education policy. John King is president of the Education Trust, a former teacher and principal. He was managing director of the Uncommon Schools Charter Network, commissioner of education in New York State, and U.S. Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. And he was recently a Democratic gubernatorial candidate in Maryland. Laura Slover is chief executive of CenterPoint Education Solutions. A former teacher herself, she spent 16 years at Achieve supervising reviews of state standards and assessments and leading the organization's work on a Common Core state standards. She later helped launch and then led PARCC in its work with states to create common assessments based on the Common Core. Laura and Mike Cohen recently wrote an extended essay for FutureEd on the standards movement and what they believe should be the next chapter of that work. Lauren Weisskirk is Chief Strategy Officer of EdReports, an organization that works with school districts, charter networks, and states on the selection and implementation of high-quality, standards-aligned curriculum materials. Previously, Lauren led instructional policy, professional learning, and management teams at the New York City Department of Education. We'll have the panel share insights for the first part of the webinar and then take audience questions via Zoom's Q&A function. So if you have questions, and I'm sure many of you will, please write them into the Q&A function and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's start with a bit of history. Laura and Mike, what are the origins of the standards movement and what problem was it trying to solve?
Thanks, Tom. I'll take the first stab at that, and then Laura will weigh in as well. And I guess I'm taking the first step because I think I was there at the creation. If you think back to the mid to late 1980s, shortly after A Nation at Risk, the standards movement began to get underway after a round of state education reforms that followed A Nation at Risk. At that point, there was a growing recognition, particularly among governors, right, and others who were involved in and worried about workforce development and the economy and opportunities for people. Growing recognition that the U.S. workforce is going to require a more highly skilled workforce. The U.S. economy would require a more highly skilled workforce than we had at the time. That's particularly as global economic competition was heating up. That was reinforced by a series of results from both the TIMSS and PISA international assessments that generally showed that U.S. students ranked relatively low compared to those in other industrialized countries with whom we compete, that we just weren't measuring up to a international standard in terms of what the economy needed. At the same time, there was also, I think, an emerging and ultimately growing recognition that students of color and low-income students were just suffering from low expectations, as you talked about it, Tom, the soft bigotry of low expectations, that was a widespread phenomena, and it was matched by limited opportunities that many students had to access to engaging curriculum, a rigorous curriculum, and to more advanced courses in high school. So standards were seen as a key part of the solution to those issues by, number one, defining what students need to know and be able to do in core academic subjects. And secondly, and most important, insisting that those expectations be applied to all the students in the state, regardless of their background and regardless of the school district they were in. Those were high standards for all kids. Now, that idea got some steam and some wind pretty quickly as we got to the end of the 1980s. First of all, there was a summit between the governors and President Bush that led to national education goals, which could not be implemented or measured without standards. So that gave the standards movement some real impetus. First of all, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics around the same time released its standards for mathematics, the first time a subject matter discipline had done that. The National Center on Education and the Economy released the America's Choice Report, which looked at other countries that were outperforming us and noticed that they all had rigorous curriculum and standards that matched. And in fact, the National Center, in partnership with LRDC at the University of Pittsburgh, launched the New Standards Project to create a set of standards and assessments that go along with it. The federal government fell in line in a number of ways. The Bush administration funded a variety of organizations to develop model national education standards in core academic subjects. The U.S. history standards didn't turn out quite to be so well received, but others were in much better shape. The Clinton administration followed that with Goals 2000, which was basically the first federal effort to support state standards-based reform. It ran into some controversy as well, in part because it advanced an idea both of academic standards, but also what we called opportunity to learn standards. And those never quite made it into the bill in any, in the final act in any form. And that began a level of political infighting around standards-based reform. And finally, skipping ahead, at some point, the business community, which was deeply involved and deeply supportive of the standards movement, got quite concerned that standards was just, being ripped apart by infighting in Washington. And in order to avoid that and keep some distance from the federal government, the governors and business leaders got together and formed an organization they called Achieve to basically provide some distance from the federal government, provide support to states as they developed and implemented standards, and also help states build support for the standards movement. So that's a short history of how the standards movement got underway.
Super helpful, thanks. Laura, let me ask you then, how should we think about the movement 3 decades later? Critics suggest that it was unsuccessful in moving the academic needle and that should be replaced by local education priorities. Do you agree? And if not, where should the movement go next?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to all the other panelists. I'm so excited to be with all of you impressive people, and I see there are a lot of friends on the line as well. So I'm going to answer that question in 2 parts. One, was it unsuccessful in moving the academic needle? And I think the answer is clearly no. It was successful in moving the academic needle. You see NAEP scores going up about 15 scale score points between 1990 and 2012-ish. So there was significant growth, and those are in math, in particular at grades 4 and 8. So the standards movement has had a positive impact, and yet academic results overall have not. They've been underwhelming. I guess there's no other way to say that. And even before the pandemic, which of course has just exacerbated existing gaps and created a even worse situation for our nation's kids. But the second question you ask is about whether standards should be replaced by local education priorities. And I guess if that question implies that states should abandon standards and leave it up to local districts, then we say no, that should not happen. But if you're asking whether there's an important role for districts to play, we say, of course, yes. And we wrote about that in our paper. The things that districts do at this moment matter the most. They select curriculum, they hire teachers, they select other surrounding materials. And because of that, districts have perhaps the most important role to play, and they need to step up to do that. And states accordingly need to step up to help them do that. Districts are responsible for building the quality core, and I know Lauren's going to talk about that, and so I don't want to get too far into that, but states need to be responsible for helping build the capacity to support that district work and hold districts accountable. And so we may be in a moment where we need to broaden the definition of accountability to include not just student achievement and growth, but also systemic coherence that begins with those choices around those core programmatic elements.
That's helpful, thanks. Let me just jump in and ask you, when you talk about state capacity building, what are you thinking of?
Well, as I said, the standards aren't going to get the job done. They're important, but insufficient. And they certainly don't execute themselves. So what states can do is to help districts make good decisions about how to implement. I'm going to give an example of Louisiana, which has done a lot of work in helping districts identify by vetting and identifying high quality curricula in order that districts have some guidance so they're not doing it all on their own. EdReports, where Lauren works, has provided a lot of national guidance around the same kind of topic. So I think of states as providing some quality control, if you will, but not delving into making exact selections for districts, because we know that's typically a district role. But sustained and coherent improvement strategies are going to require that states not just say, go off and do what you will, but actually hold districts accountable for doing those things and support them in implementing those programs.
Thanks. So in a sentence, how would you describe the unfinished agenda of the standards reform?
Well, I think coherence is the next piece of the agenda, where districts are implementing high quality curriculum with coherence around and intentionality around the core, they're having an impact. But that degree of coherence is the exception and it's not the norm. And again, I don't want to take Lauren's statements away from her, but EdReports has recently released a report which shows that the majority of districts in this country are not yet using aligned high quality materials. But the evidence is that where districts are doing those things, they are seeing improvements. And so this is, to me and to Mike in our paper, we called up on this as a loud signal that coherence matters, and that the next step along the pathway is to make sure that districts have strong implementation of the standards.
Got it. So let's come back to that. But Checker, as you well know, the campaign for high standards for more students was a bipartisan effort, as Mike suggested. What brought Republican and Democrat leaders together in the standards movement? And then why did the bipartisan support dissolve over time?
Well, I want to first do a little gloss on what Mike and Laura said, because to me, the standards movement isn't just about standards and curriculum. It's also about assessments and accountability. And I don't think that tripod, as I've always thought of it, has been yet clearly stated in this webinar. Standards describe a destination where you'd like kids to get. Assessments are a measuring stick to see how far along the path to that destination they are. And accountability is, what do you do about it if they're not getting where they need to be? Do you intervene in their schools? Do you intervene in their lives? Do you not let them go to fourth grade? Do you reward or punish their teachers? Do you put their schools on probation? I mean, there are a whole bunch of things under the accountability category. So to me, it's always been a tripod. Mike and Laura's paper usefully adds a kind of capacity building side to that tripod. So maybe it becomes a four-legged table if you want a different sort of visual image, and I'm fine with that. And yeah, it was bipartisan. In the 80s, the governors were teamed up on this stuff after Nation at Risk, and at Charlottesville in '89, they were teamed up on this stuff. And as Mike Cohen said, it kind of continued in a relatively bipartisan way. I mean, Congress wasn't always on board with the administration and things like that, but continued a relatively bipartisan way right on up through at least 2002 enactment of No Child Left Behind at the federal level, because there's been a federal hand here that needs to be understood. And then it became bipartisan again, at least briefly, in 2015 at the federal level with enactment of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Mm-hmm. But the bipartisan aspect of it has been deteriorating. And that's partly because bipartisan everything has been deteriorating in America. I mean, this is not mostly about education. This is mostly about America's schismatic nature at this point in its history. And what I think of as craziness on both sides, at the outer ends of both sides, and the sort of loss of a middle in general. So let's not let that go away. But we had other things come along. We had a kind of Common Core fracas, which caused a kind of politicization of a set of very good standards that led mostly Republicans to say, Obama's for that. He's forcing it on states. Not a good idea. We don't like Obama, and we don't like forcing things on states, and it's a national curriculum. Shame on us. So it's been coming apart along with everything else.
Yeah, fair enough. John, I wanted to bring you in the conversation. So before you moved into leadership roles at the U.S. Department of Education, you led the implementation of New York's rollout of the Common Core standards. So first, tell us why you embraced that work as you did. You know, some states were less enthusiastic. Some state leaders were less enthusiastic than others. But you and your colleagues in New York embraced them. First, why?
Yeah, well, we saw an opportunity to dramatically accelerate college and career readiness in the state. We knew that our performance on the NAEP, for example, was fairly stagnant. And we knew that we had significant gaps for Black and Latino students and low-income students. And we saw in the Common Core an opportunity to accelerate progress. And it's worth saying, the Race to the Top application meant we also could access significant federal resources in the midst of a national financial crisis to invest in district capacity building. And that seemed like a great opportunity for the state.
Fair enough. So what were the biggest challenges that emerged in that sort of ambitious work that you were doing, trying to implement something statewide?
You know, I think Laura and Mike did a nice job in their paper articulating the gap between standards adoption and standards realization in the classroom. And we in New York use our Race to the Top resources to try to tackle that gap between the aspirations of the standards and classroom practice. I think we're the only state to put significant resources into the production of high quality instructional materials. Engage New York, the website we launched to share those materials, became the most used curricular resource in the country. We helped invest in the development of the core knowledge curriculum, the expeditionary learning curriculum, the Eureka math curriculum, all of which have become standard bearers, if you will, of high quality instructional materials. Those curricula are the ones that places like Louisiana have incentivized their districts to adopt. And we also organize network team institutes modeled on what Mike and Laura described in their paper in terms of professional development and capacity building. We were bringing together instructional leaders in every district to try to help them understand how they should approach implementing the standards. In terms of challenges, you know, I'd say one structural, one political, and one more instructional. The structural challenge is New York has 700 districts. And as a country, most of the authority in K-12 education, as everyone on this panel knows, to districts, to local level decision makers. We couldn't in New York say everyone needed to adopt these high quality instructional materials. Everyone needed to invest in professional development. That was a district by district decision. And in New York City, our largest district, a school level decision where individual principals were choosing curriculum and professional development strategies. So that decentralization was a structural challenge. The political challenge, Checker described very well. You know, there was an attack from the right on the Common Core, people calling it Obama Core, saying it was conspiracy by the Obama administration to take over children's minds. And then you had people on the left who attacked the implementation of the Common Core because of the connection and Race to the Top to teacher evaluation and new assessments. And you had people saying it was a conspiracy by foundations to take over children's minds. So you had folks on both ends sort of attacking the Common Core, and that created a political distraction. And then the third, and maybe this is the hardest challenge, it's really instructional. We adopted through the Engage New York curricula that were open source, available to everybody, that built on the science of reading. But we didn't have an educator workforce trained in the science of reading. We adopted in Eureka Math a high quality curriculum that reflected the standards that required teachers to have deep, what some might refer to as pedagogical content knowledge in math, and understanding themselves of conceptually of math. And that was lacking for many of our educators. So that capacity gap, even with high quality materials, made it very hard to have successful execution. So, you know, on the whole, the materials made a difference. The instructional improvements made a difference. Obviously, we've lost ground all over the country because of the COVID disruption. But I think tackling those structural, political, and instructional challenges is the work going forward.
So that's the takeaway.
Yeah, look, and I think, you know, back to Checker's point, you know, this is all in the context of a broader sort of national political crisis around the loss of the ability to have actual bipartisan initiatives. And that's a problem that goes well beyond education. That's a deeper societal problem we have to grapple with.
Yep, fair enough. So Lauren, in a study that you and your colleagues conducted just before the pandemic, you found that despite the growing availability of well-aligned curriculum materials of the sort that John just mentioned, nationally, only 16% of English language arts materials and 26% of math materials used by teachers are in fact aligned to standards. So based on your time in New York, where you're working on these issues, and more recently at EdReports, where you've really gone deep on this and worked with local education, state and local education leaders nationally, how do we solve that problem?
Oh, that's easy. How do we solve it? Got it. So, well, a little bit of good news is since that report came out prior to the pandemic, we've actually seen a significant increase in the number of teachers who are using aligned instructional materials regularly. So we're up to 49% of math teachers and 32% of ELA teachers. That is striking. That is a lot of improvement, and notably over the course of the pandemic. So what that says to me, and really speaks to me about, is the priority that teachers and districts are placing on getting that fundamental component of education right. Like, how are they at the end of the day in a classroom, right? You've got teachers, you've got students, and you've got the content that is guiding instruction. And we've seen an increase in that, in those investments. And 94% of teachers say that standards aligned materials are very important to them. So we're talking a lot about the states, which is important. I could go on forever about which states are implementing which policies to what end, but I think it's really telling that teachers are also really asking for high quality instructional materials and the professional development they deserve in order to understand how to not use these, treat them as a script or just have them in the back of a classroom, but actually use them with the 30 children in their classroom. So how do we solve it? There are many, many variables, but I can tell you we aren't going to solve it if we continue to have disconnected professional learning, disconnected curricula, and not that the way to ensure that students from when we get them in kindergarten are on that path and have the content they need for when they're graduating high school.
So those are the components, thank you. Those are the components of this instructional core that Laura referenced.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I just want to add one thing, and I appreciate Lauren adding the professional learning that teachers deserve. That's so important. Many of you know my background in assessment, and that assessment is my favorite topic. So I just want to add that assessment literacy and data literacy are part and parcel of that professional development around curriculum. In fact, in several of the districts that we've worked with, they're intentionally building that professional learning to include both assessment information and okay, now what do we do with our curriculum and our instruction? So knitting those things together is really important to overall coherence and effectiveness.
Thanks. So I want to come back to go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Tom, I just want to jump in on a couple of points here.
Sure.
One is the tripod that Checker described. I'm increasingly thinking, have been for a long time thinking, that we really left out the fourth piece of this, which is local capacity for instructional improvement. And in some sense, it's striking that we sort of left that off the table in any serious way from the outset. Part of that, I think, comes back to the gubernatorial role in leading this. I was at NGA when they put out their time for results report in 1985, which then Governor Lamar Alexander, who led that effort, basically talked about a horse trade with the education community. We, the governors, will hold you accountable for results, in exchange for which we will give you the flexibility to figure out how to best deliver them. Had the horse trade, and all the governors signed on to that, Had the horse trade at that point been, we'll hold you accountable for results and help you build the capacity to deliver them, we would have had, I think, a very different trajectory of education reform and education achievement. But that was easier to see in hindsight than it was in the moment. But John's conversation about the capacity limitations with all the districts in New York State and the inability to help them move forward, that's just another piece of this. I keep coming back to, we missed the capacity piece seriously at the outset of this. And I know from my experience at the education department in the 90s, that was the last thing that the education department could help anybody deal with it. Maybe when John got there, they were better positioned, but the idea that the federal government could figure out how to help states provide support to districts, there wasn't a conversation about that. That was grounded in reality. And everything about the implementation of the standards turned out to be a curriculum and instruction issue, not surprisingly. And the last thing you want to talk about if you're sitting at the US Department of Education is what we can do about curriculum. It was hard enough for John to deal with that in Albany, but man, is it hard from the education department. So we really don't have a structure that makes it easy to do any of these things, and we're paying a price for it.
Thanks. Mr. Checker.
I just want to underscore the problem of our capacity to build capacity. It's not only lacking at the federal level, it is lacking by and large at the state level. Governors could have promised to help build capacity, and then they would have turned to their state education departments to do it. At any given moment over the last 30 years, I think I could name at any given moment, maybe 5 state education departments out of 50 that I would think had the capacity to do this at a reasonable level across their states. And that leaves you 45 others that lack the capacity to build capacity. So we're talking about something that we don't have the machinery to do.
Yeah. So John, how did you solve that problem in New York?
Well, I don't know that we solved it. I mean, we use Race to the Top resources to create capacity that didn't exist before Race to the Top at the SEA and in districts, as well as supporting our regional service providers. In New York, there are boards of cooperative educational services that provide services to the districts essentially outside of the big cities. And those BOCES were a key part of our implementation strategy. We invested in their ability to support capacity building in districts. But honestly, it wasn't enough money. It was in the midst of the post-2008 financial crisis.
Right.
And so the Race to Top funds were helpful, but at the same time, districts were struggling with diminished state and local resources. So I agree with Mike's point that we just haven't made a big enough bet as a country or as individual states in capacity building. I will add to the conversation one vehicle for capacity building that Mike tried to build in with the work at Achieve and Laura tried to build in with the work at PARCC that didn't really come to fruition was the role of higher education. Higher education is where teachers are trained. Higher education is uniquely positioned to build public will around what college readiness means. In the early days of the standards development, higher ed leaders were at the table. In the early days of building PARCC and Smarter Balance, higher ed leaders were at the table.
Right.
But for a variety of reasons, including a lack of investment in those institutions, they didn't really stay at the table as fully. And you can see that in that higher ed hasn't even come up in this conversation so far.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. Thank you for raising it. Lauren, so you're very familiar with the Louisiana story. Did higher ed play a role there? And how more generally did John White pull off, if you will, the ambitious work that he did down there on behalf of a stronger instructional core built on standards?
I'm going to flip my answer a little bit. I'm going to start with what we saw from Louisiana, and then we've seen other states model, and I think it's important to say across political leanings, we have seen this happen in states like Rhode Island and Ohio and still Florida. We can always talk about some of the nuances of that story, but across political leanings, we've seen that states really can do three things. They can signal quality. Almost, I don't know, roughly half, a little less than half of states produce some sort of guidance for districts about which materials should be adopted. And historically, those lists could be like 30 titles long, not particularly helpful, or they could be short. And we found in the early days of EdReports, they weren't necessarily capturing materials that are aligned to standards. So really at this moment, states, we're seeing a real effort to provide a crisper signal, like districts, place your energy here. Same with incentives. Another thing that Louisiana did is they set up incentives to make the best choice for districts the easiest choice.
Financial incentives?
Yeah, and like support through RFP processes, which are cumbersome, to say the least. Like, how can you actually make this they got rid of a recommended list in order to develop a series of incentives to help districts find their path. And then finally, support. So how can states, again, use their power as like a unit that can bring districts together and provide support for implementation, understanding of standards, et cetera. Louisiana did that well, and we're seeing other states pick up that mantle and lead to pretty significant changes in the adoption of quality materials. With higher ed, that's kind of been the next wave. So it's we've seen after states are getting their signaling down, then they start thinking about higher ed and how to provide incentives for higher education teacher training programs to be aligned to quality materials and assessment, like how to align their curriculum, how to align with what districts are going to be using. So incorporating that as part of your teacher training. So you're not just learning how to create a lesson plan from scratch, you're also understanding the nuts and bolts of what quality materials are, how that aligns to standards, and what it'll actually look like when you go to implement in the classroom. So that is something that's been starting. I won't say we've seen full like success or fruition of that yet, but it is something multiple states are considering.
And what kind of incentives are the states giving higher ed, giving the teacher training institutions?
And others, please jump in if you have other examples than mine. We've seen it be incorporated into their licensure. So how do you incorporate that as part of like the program, like evaluation from the state? We've also seen different states open up seats at the table to provide incentives to be there as part of the conversation. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's what we're trying to do for the students in the state. We're not going to keep higher ed out of it. We want you here to help develop the plan. And so sometimes the incentives can be more like a cudgel, and sometimes it's more of a welcoming and encouraging people to be a part of this coherent planning from the beginning.
Great, thank you. John, I'm curious, what's your sense, if you've stayed in touch with the work in New York, what's your sense of the State Department's ability to sustain the new infrastructure on behalf of the instructional core that you helped create?
When the race to the top money ran out, the state capacity shrunk significantly. And
can you lean in? I don't know if others can hear you.
Sure. I was saying that after the race of top dollars ran out, the SEA's capacity to do instructional support diminished significantly. And there weren't new state dollars. I think in the early days of the Obama administration, the hope was people would see them the return from the race to the top investments and states would sustain them over the long run. That didn't really happen. And with the latest investment of dollars, states have been all over the place in terms of the extent to which they have actually leveraged American Rescue Plan dollars or ESSER dollars to address high quality instructional materials and core instruction. Some states, as Lauren described, have made big bets there, and others haven't really attended to that at all.
Yeah, interesting. But it is interesting to go back again to Lauren's reference to the increased number of states that have embraced aligned instructional materials and curriculum materials. You know, that's a big increase, and so it's really kind of surprising given the chaos, if you will, of the pandemic. Checker, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, I've got to say this. I don't want to underplay the importance of resources, but the will and the political leadership and the local willingness are at least as important as the dollars on the table for getting any of this done. If you do not have the capacity at the state level, the political leadership at the state level, political consensus at the state level, and then districts that are willing and have the brain power, the personal capacity, the brain capacity, political capacity, the board capacity to say, okay, we know how to do this, or help us do this. We want to do this. I keep fearing that the places that need it the most are the least likely to reach out for it.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in there and it kind of, I mean, think of what Checker said. States lack the capacity to build the capacity. And I think he was just on that subject as well. And it made me think that instructional coherence is a capacity challenge, much more than a compliance issue or a local will issue. It doesn't happen because in places where it doesn't happen because districts are opposed to it per se. It's that they have rarely either been seriously asked to do that or don't have the tools and the capacity to do it. And so if we think about what states can do, I mean, I think one bright light is what the Council of Chief State School Officers is doing with their HQIM, high quality instructional materials working group, in which they're working with a set of states, I can't remember which ones, to really think about building both state and local capacity for implementation. That would be a good group to have on your next webinar.
Well, also, don't forget that the average school district in America has, I think, 1,650 students. So we're talking about a vast number of districts where the superintendent is also the principal, is maybe the bus driver sometimes, to Checker's point about capacity, right? So it's really tough without external support. And I'll put in a plug for your organizations to say that one of the things that has emerged in the last decade or so is organizations like EdReports and CenterPoint, among others, that have the capacity to support state and local efforts on these fronts, because there's just not enough of it, as we've all been saying. I got to ask one more question really fast here before we go to the Q&A, and there are lots of questions, and I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of them, but as Checker has said, and as Laura has alluded to, assessments are really an important part of this. But there's, as everybody knows, there's real tension between between folks on how best to use tests. There's a lot of criticism of the federally mandated state assessments that serve one role versus the local so-called formative assessments that are designed to support instruction. How should we think about assessments in this new era of focus on the instructional core that you're advocating?
Well, I'll take this one. I'll lead this one because it is my favorite topic. And as you heard, Mike at Achieve, Mike and I supported states in launching the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. Such a good name that we now call it PARCC, because nobody could remember all those other things. And John King, in his role in New York, was a leader in that that effort and sat on the PARCC governing board. And notwithstanding that we tried to build the most awesome, most informative, most tightly aligned assessment in the history of state assessment programs. And we achieved great things with that assessment program, much more focus on accessibility. We basically helped transform the country into using digital assessments, whereas prior to the consortium, most states were giving pencil and paper tests. So I don't want to downplay our accomplishments at all. And yet it really did reach a tipping point where there was a very heavy emphasis on the end of year assessment. And what the end of year assessment wasn't able to do, because results came back so slowly, was to really help educators in the moment make decisions about instruction. So what Mike and I propose in the paper is that moving forward, we need a system of assessments that cut across the state and the district, and make the most use of the function of each of those kind of assessment anchors. End of year state tests are really good at looking at what school systems do and helping identify and trends over time and help hold school systems accountable for delivering equitable education to all students. And that's what they should do. And that's what we need them to do. District level assessments have the power to ensure that schools themselves and educators have the information they need when they need it to support student learning at the moment they need it. And some combination of those things are critical in order to answer the questions about what are we trying to do? What information do we need to know? As Checker said earlier, what information do we need to know to be able to arm people with data? And then who needs to know? Who needs to know should drive just as much as what do they need to know, the question about which assessments to use when. So all that is to say, we think there's an important role for state assessment because it serves equity purposes and transparency purposes. And yet we think that we need to start shifting the weight into districts, onto districts, to be able to measure content that is more proximate to student learning, more tightly aligned with the curriculum that they're using, and then much more embedded in professional learning opportunities for educators to make sense of all that data in order to know what to do with it to drive student learning.
Super helpful. Thank you. Checker, last comment, and then we'll go to
I agree with everything that Laura just said, but I want to say it's simpler.
That's a moment in history itself. I just want to note that.
Stop searching for the holy grail of a single test that is both formative and summative, and we should accept the reality that we need both, and they will come from different places and be used for different but complementary purposes, period. End of statement.
Amen,
Here.
says the moderator.
Here, here.
All right, great. So here's a question. How can mandates be established to ensure that, quote, low performing, unquote, students are made a priority, just as high performing and mid-level performing students in all public schools? Chucker, you had a thought on that. You want to share that with the wider group?
Well, yeah, I think that the federal law has made low performing students the priority, at least since NCLB, with the stated goal, and arguably oversimplified goal, being getting everybody over a proficiency bar. And I tend to be more critical of neglecting the kids above the proficiency bar who have so much potential for further growth. So I believe that, at least as driven by federal policy, low performing kids are the priority, and I think that's fine. I mean, I'm all for that. The more we emphasize growth, however, the more we can deal with kids across the spectrum of current performance, and should do so. The reason, going back to my earliest days on the National Assessment Governing Board, the reason we had 3 levels of achievement instead of 1 was because we understood at the beginning that we needed basic and proficient and advanced, and arguably today there's need for a fourth level somewhere under basic. But anyway, let's work at all those levels, please.
John, when you were in the administration, how were you thinking about this proficiency versus growth issue, and add any other sort of perspective you'd like to?
Yeah, look, I think the addition of growth through the Every Student Succeeds Act was an improvement on the accountability model of NCLB and an opportunity to make sure that all students are making progress and to address some of what Checker is flagging, where people focus only on the students who are sort of just below the proficiency line, rather than looking at the needs of all students across the performance spectrum. So that was good to add growth. I do think it's worth flagging that this is another place where capacity is a big problem. That just because you've identified here are the students who are struggling doesn't mean you know then what to do next. And more support around supporting students with disabilities, English learners, building curricula in which kids can see themselves reflected, diversifying our teaching profession, all of those capacity issues are part of how we improve performance. And we've never made that investment. And so part of the political problem we have is that for a lot of educators, the assessment and accountability systems seem like blame rather than an opportunity to get support to help their students do better. I also think we have to name that many of our challenges in this country go beyond just what happens in schools. We need teachers to do everything possible with the levers they have, but we also need to address underlying issues of child poverty, of inadequate access to healthcare, lead poisoning. I mean, there are lots of factors. And I think sometimes educators feel like education leaders don't acknowledge frequently enough those other factors that impact students.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think perhaps one consequence of the pandemic is that there's a greater awareness among policymakers at all levels of that reality, of the complexity of the challenges, the multifacetedness of the challenges that students bring with them to school. Obviously, educators have been well aware of that for a long time, but it's been hard to bring more people serving students in other capacities in their lives together with educators to help solve these problems. And maybe that's some sliver of a silver lining from the pandemic. So Lauren, here's a question for you. Could you also speak to the equity considerations for students with disabilities, English language learners, et cetera, low-income students?
Yeah, and this is a place where there is a really important study done a couple of years ago by TNTP, the Opportunity Myth, that helped show that students were like 3/4 of the assignment students were getting were not on grade level. And so what people were doing was, even if they had high quality materials, were going and making adjustments and stripping the rigor out.
Dumbing down instruction, as they say.
Yeah, in order to support students who are behind grade level, students with disabilities, multilingual learners, et cetera. And so one of the things, this gets back to the PD point from earlier, it is not enough to simply throw a curriculum at a school and hope that it gets used well. We need to be supporting, first of all, we need to identify curriculum, and curriculum themselves need to improve to have better supports built from the beginning, not retrofitted on later, from the beginning for students with disabilities and multilingual learners. So that's A. And then B, we really need to make sure people understand why these are so important. So part of the challenge here is that it's very easy to walk around and say, I believe that all students deserve quality materials. That's one thing, but it's harder, and we need to do more to help show what does it actually look like. It looks like it means making a change to how we've trained teachers, how we support them, how we coach them, and what resources we provide on the back end, or the front end, excuse me.
Thank you. Mike, here's a related question for you. Someone in the audience asks, weren't the opportunity to learn standards that you alluded to in your opening remarks and resulting funds intended for capacity building?
Good question. I think the best answer I can give is, number one, the opportunity to learn standards were a good idea and never made it into any federal legislation. So there were also never any federal funds targeted for that. That said, both the funds that states and districts received under Goals 2000 and especially Title I funds, right, were all sort of available, right, to deal with opportunity to learn issues. They were never used. They were rarely used in that manner. Certainly not the Title I funds in any specific way. And I paid about as much attention as anyone has to how the Goals 2000 funds were used, and I can't say that they were directed in that area either. It was a big miss.
All right, thank you. So here's another question for all of you. How do we help schools and leaders understand that we need to go slow to go fast and decrease the number of initiatives instead of increasing them in order to improve implementation of any assessment or instructional initiative? I mean, there's a fairly substantial premise built into that, but which you could also address if you'd like.
Look, another way of stating that premise, I think, is that everything, at least that I've learned over 30, 40 years of this, and everything that was behind what we put into our paper, is that we need to build the capacity of local districts to create and implement and sustain high quality instructional programs. And that ought to take priority over adding new initiatives at this point. I mean, we should have been doing this a long time ago. Number one. Number two, if building and sustaining high quality instructional programs is not the core business of local school districts, then what is, right? And what will it take to get, the funds that are available more effectively targeted to that purpose?
I'll just jump in and say that a lot of this comes down to leadership. I completely agree with what Mike said. And yet in the political environment that John and Checker referenced, sustained leadership is infrequent. And, as a person who's served on boards of education, both the DC State Board of Education, and now I'm on the board of a charter school, you can see why lots of initiatives continue to come at you, because somebody new joins and has a new, often valuable perspective, and creates new imperative to do more, better, different. And because of that churn at both the board level and at the leadership level in schools, districts, and states, often things get added on without people saying, well, wait, stop. If we're going to do this other thing, what are we going to stop doing? And that, I think, needs to be a critical piece of policymaking. Yes, we can do this, but we also have to take something off the table.
Also fair to say, perhaps, that the new agenda that you're proposing here, the additional sort of work that you're proposing, is really in service of completing the unfinished agenda that we've been working on in this country for a long time through the standards movement, right? So in a sense, new is old, and hence not new. Lauren?
Oh, just building on Laura's point too, we have an opportunity, particularly now coming out of the pandemic, and we're facing teacher shortages, and we know teacher morale is, very low. A lot of people are thinking about leaving the profession. We have a time right now to listen to what teachers want, and what they want is high quality materials, PD that's really going to help them with their craft. And to the questioner's point, not a lot of initiatives at this time. We can slow down right here. And personally, I'm really excited to think what happens if we get that foundation tight. How much innovation, how much room for innovation would be created if we aren't spending our time in the classroom or as a district curriculum leaders churning out, trying to create, trying to adjust at all moments, and could actually have that foundation in place. I think that's an exciting next wave.
What a great note to end on. Very positive. Thank you. So thank you to the audience for all your questions, and thank you very much to all of you on the panel for your thoughtful analysis and insight. I'm personally very grateful, and I think the audience is too. So thanks a lot. And we will have the recording of the FutureEd and CenterPoint session on our respective websites in the coming days, if anybody would like to come and listen to it there. Thanks again, and good luck to all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Nice to see you.
Privilege.